The storm hit the Ethira plateau like a fist at midday, punching through the temple's ancient wardstones and sending a crack of violet lightning into the courtyard well. Shaman Vekara felt it in his knees before the thunder reached his ears, a deep, groaning vibration that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with the thing sealed beneath the refectory floor. He was already moving. Through the corridor, past the prayer alcoves where novices pressed their foreheads to cold basalt, past the open kitchen arch where Marit, the refugee cook, was ladling the noon broth into clay bowls with the steady efficiency of a woman who had been feeding strangers since before the temple hired her. The smell of bone broth and wild garlic followed him down the spiral stair, but he did not slow. There were 7 locks on the undercroft door. He checked every one. All held. He pressed his palm to the center seal, the one he had renewed with his own blood every solstice for the last 31 years, and felt the faintest answering pulse. Slow, weak, like a heartbeat underwater. Still alive, then. Good. He turned from the door and climbed back up the stair, and on the landing he nearly collided with Marit, who was carrying a tray of bowls toward the dining hall. "Shaman," she said, steadying the tray. She was 43, broad-shouldered, with lines around her eyes that came from squinting into cook fires and from grief she never spoke about. Her apron was stained with turmeric, and she smelled like the kitchen heat and herbs and honest sweat. "The novices are asking about the noise. Tell them it was the wardstones discharging, seasonal, nothing more." She looked at him a moment longer than necessary. Marit had been at the Temple of Tethashari for 11 months. She had arrived with the second wave of displaced laborers from the Vosk Valley collapse, mine workers, cooks, laundry hands, people whose lives had been swallowed by a cave-in the size of a city district. The temple had taken in 40. 36 had moved on within weeks. 4 had stayed, 2 groundskeepers, 1 mason, and Marit. She never asked questions about the temple's inner workings, which was one of the reasons Vekara had allowed her to stay. She cooked, she cleaned the refectory, she fed anyone who sat at her tables. That was her entire theology. He watched her carry the tray into the hall, and then he shut the stairway door behind him and turned the lock. The first law of Tethashari was carved into the lintel above that lock. No one descends. No one touches. No one speaks of what lies beneath. Vekara had kept that law for 31 years. His predecessor had kept it for 40. Before that, Shaman Allah had kept it for 28. Before that, the records crumbled. Some said the law was older than the temple itself. The undercroft had been sealed for so long that the novices treated the first law the way they treated the prohibition against singing during the equinox fast, as a tradition without a reason. An arbitrary stricture from an older, stranger age. None of them had heard the sound that Vekara heard every solstice when he renewed the seal. None of them had felt the door pulse against their palm. None of them knew what was dying down there. The storm passed. Evening came. Vekara led the Vespers chant, and the wardstones settled, and the novices filed off to their cells, and the temple fell into its routine of silence and stone. Marit was washing the last pot when the sound came again. Not thunder this time. A vibration that came up through the kitchen floor and into the soles of her feet and through the bones of her legs and settled in her chest like a second heartbeat. She set the pot down, pressed her hands flat to the stone counter, listened. It was faint, rhythmic, and enormous, a sound too low for the ear but too persistent to ignore, like something breathing in a space that was far too large for anything beneath a kitchen floor. She had noticed it before, 3 times in 11 months, always after storms, always at night. The first time she had asked the groundskeeper about it, he had shrugged. The second time she had mentioned it to novice Prin, who had gone pale and said, "Don't talk about what's under the floor, it's the first law." The third time tonight she did not ask anyone. She dried her hands. She walked to the stairway door. It was locked. Marit stood there for a long time. She was not a curious woman by nature. 11 months of cooking for a temple full of ascetics had not made her one. But she had spent the first 30 years of her life feeding people, mine workers, children, hospital wards, refugee lines, and she knew the sound of hunger when she heard it. Not the sound of a dangerous thing rattling a cage. The sound of something that had not been fed. She went back to the kitchen, ladled broth into the deepest clay bowl she had, cut a quarter loaf of bread and tucked it against the rim, wrapped the bowl in a cloth and tucked it against her hip. Then she went back to the stairway door and, with a kitchen knife and a hairpin, worked the lock. It took her 4 minutes. She had locked herself out of a pantry often enough to know the trick. The stair was dark but not empty. The basalt steps were worn smooth by centuries of feet, shaman's feet, she realized, one pair at a time, going down and coming back. The walls were carved with glyphs she could not read, but the shapes looked like warnings. Triangles, eyes, something with wings, stylized into sharp angles that could have been decoration or could have been a diagram of a thing too large to illustrate faithfully. The air smelled of mineral water, and something else, something warm and metallic, like sun-baked iron, which made no sense for a space that had not seen sunlight in living memory. She counted 47 steps. At the landing where the stair turned, her hand brushed a groove in the wall at shoulder height, a handhold polished smooth, worn into the stone by the grip of every shaman who had ever steadied themselves at this point before continuing down. She used it. The stone was warm. At the bottom, a door. 7 locks, all mechanical, all massive. She could not pick those. But the center seal, a flat disc of dark metal set into the door at chest height, was warm to the touch. She pressed her palm to it the way she might press her hand to a door in a burning building to test the heat, and the disc hummed against her skin, and the 7 locks opened, one after another, like tumblers in a sequence she had activated by accident or by something stranger than accident. The door swung inward. The undercroft was enormous. The ceiling was vaulted high enough to lose itself in shadow, and the floor was smooth stone, and the far wall curved away into darkness, and in the center of the space, curled around itself like a mountain that had decided to lie down, was a dragon. Merritt had never seen a dragon. She had heard of them the way everyone on the plateau had heard of them, as legend, as carvings on temple walls, as the reason certain mountains were forbidden. The Ash sovereignty, the great dragon hierarchy that had once ruled the plateau's upper reaches, had withdrawn 4 centuries ago. The last confirmed sighting was older than anyone alive. This one was real. It was enormous, and it was ancient, and it was dying. The scales were the color of deep bronze, gone to verdigris, some dull and flaking, others cracked along the ridges where they overlapped. The wings were folded tight against the body, and Merritt could see where the membrane between the bones had thinned to translucency, light from the luminescent fungi on the walls passing through like sun through a dead leaf. The claws were the length of her forearm, and they were curled inward, and the great head rested on the stone floor with the jaw slightly open, and the eyes, vast, amber, clouded with cataracts, were open and looking at her. The breathing she had heard through the floor was real. Each breath expanded the ribcage by the width of a doorway. Each exhale carried a faint, dry rattle. Merritt stood in the doorway with a bowl of broth and a quarter loaf of bread, and looked at the largest living thing she had ever seen. "Well," she said, because she had been feeding people in difficult circumstances for 30 years, and the protocol was always the same. "You look like you haven't eaten." The dragon did not move. Its eyes tracked her 2 amber discs, each the size of a serving platter, clouded but aware. The slit pupils contracted faintly. She walked forward. Her footsteps echoed. The space was so large that the echo came back to her twice. She stopped 10 paces from the head and knelt, not out of reverence, but because the head was on the floor and she needed to be at the same level. She unwrapped the bowl. The steam rose and curled in the cold air, and the dragon's nostrils flared 2 caverns, each large enough to fit her hand, and for the first time the breathing changed. Faster, shallower. "It's just broth," she said. "Bone broth. Salt, wild garlic, thyme from the courtyard, nothing fancy." She set the bowl on the stone in front of the massive jaw. The bread she placed beside it. Then she sat back on her heels and waited. The dragon's tongue emerged. It was the length of a cot, dark and rough-textured, and it moved with painful slowness. It touched the surface of the broth and retracted, touched again. The third time it curled under the bowl and tipped the contents into the back of the jaw in one long, slow movement. The bowl shattered. Merritt flinched, then shrugged. She had plenty of bowls. The dragon swallowed. The throat muscles moved visibly, a ripple running the length of the neck the way a snake's body moves around a meal. Then the head settled again, and the eyes closed, and the exhale that followed was deeper and slower than any that had come before it. The rattle was still there, but softer, like a door that had been stuck for years, cracking open an inch. Something shifted in the heat haze near the dragon's body. Merritt squinted. One of the flaking scales near the jaw, a piece the size of her hand, curled at the edges like a dead leaf had detached. It lay on the stone, and beneath it the skin was raw and new, not healed, but alive, growing. She filed that away. She picked up the broken pieces of the bowl and the untouched bread and climbed back up the stairs. She did not close the 7-locked door because she did not know how. She pulled the stairway door shut behind her and went to bed. She slept badly. Twice she woke to the vibration through the mattress, the breathing, steady now but different from before, slower, deeper, as if the creature had remembered what rest felt like. In the morning, Vikara found the stairway door unlocked and the undercroft door open, and the shattered remains of a clay bowl on the floor 10 paces from the dragon's jaw. He knew immediately who had done it. There was no one else in the temple with the combination of a lockpick's pragmatism and a cook's instinct to feed the unfed. He found Merritt in the kitchen, already working on the morning porridge. He closed the door behind him. "You went downstairs." She did not look up. "Yes." "You opened the undercroft." "It opened for me. I only touched the seal." That stopped him. He stood very still. The seal should not have responded to her. It was keyed to the shaman's blood, renewed every solstice. It had never responded to anyone else. "The first law exists for a reason," he said carefully. "What lies beneath this temple is not a stray animal. It is Ashenvale, the last sovereign of the Ash Dominion. 400 years ago the Dominion burned half the plateau, cities, farmland, everything. The treaty that ended it required Ashenvale's imprisonment, sealed beneath this temple, bound by ward stones, watched by a line of shamans who swore never to let it wake." "It's not asleep," Merritt said. She stirred the porridge. "It's starving." "It is contained." "Those are different things." Vikara pressed his palms together, the way he did when he was trying not to raise his voice. "You do not understand what you've done. Ashenvale is not a creature that needs your mercy. It is a power that leveled cities. The seal keeps its influence contained. The wardstones keep its call from reaching the Dominion remnants in the upper ranges. If the Ash Court learns their sovereign still lives, they will come for it. And what happened 400 years ago will happen again." Merritt set the ladle down. She looked at him, and her expression was the same expression she had worn when she told the mine foremen that their workers needed a midday meal, and when she told the hospital administrator that patients could not recover on broth alone, and when she told the refugee camp director that children eat first. It was not defiance. It was something simpler and harder to argue with. "Shaman Vikara, I spent 6 hours last night listening to that thing breathe. Its scales are falling off. Its wing membranes are transparent. It can barely lift its own tongue. Whatever it was 400 years ago, right now it is a creature that has been left alone in the dark to starve. And I am the cook. Feeding things is what I do." The treaty didn't say anything about starving it. I read the lintel. No one descends, no one touches, no one speaks of it. Nothing about letting it die of neglect. Vicara opened his mouth, then closed it. She had technically a point. The first law was a prohibition against contact and disclosure, not an explicit instruction to let the prisoner waste away. The shamans had fed Ashenvale in the early centuries. The old records described it. But at some point, one shaman had decided the feedings were unnecessary, and the practice had been forgotten, and no one had corrected the lapse because no one went down to look. I will bring it broth, Merritt said. Once a day, I won't touch it, I won't speak of it to anyone. I will keep the first law in every way that matters, but I will not stand in a kitchen directly above a starving creature and pretend I don't know it's there. He should have said no. He should have resealed the door, renewed the wardstones, and dismissed her from the temple. That was his duty and the strict letter of his charge. Instead he said, the broth alone won't be enough. It's a sovereign. Its body runs at a temperature that would boil water. You'll need to fortify it bone marrow, rendered fat, mineral salt. I'll write down the proportions. Merritt blinked. You know what it eats. The old shamans kept records. They're not forbidden, just forgotten. He pulled a chair from the corner and sat down heavily. He was 64 years old, and he had been carrying the weight of a dying god beneath his feet for 31 years, and the relief of sharing it with someone, even a refugee cook with no sense of theological propriety, was physical. His shoulders dropped 2 inches. I'll show you the feeding protocol, the old one from before the practice lapsed. There are things you need to know. The heat near its body will burn your skin if you get within arm's reach. The scales that have fallen, don't touch them with bare hands. And the eyes, when the cataracts clear, and they will if it feeds, the eyes carry influence. You'll feel an urge to stay, to sit closer, to lay your hand on its jaw. That's not kindness, that's the sovereign bond. It's how the Ash Court formed, individuals bonded to the sovereign, bound by loyalty deeper than reason. The first law exists because anyone who bonds is no longer fully their own. You're saying the soup might cost me my free will. I'm saying the proximity might. The feeding is the excuse to stay close long enough. Merritt picked the ladle back up. I've been losing my free will to kitchens for 30 years. At least this one won't complain about the seasoning. Vicara did not smile, but he wrote down the proportions. The feeding began. Every evening, after the novices' supper, Merritt descended the spiral stair carrying a reinforced iron pot, clay shattered in the heat near the dragon's body, filled with the fortified broth Vicara had described. Bone marrow from the temple's goat herd, rendered fat, a specific mineral salt that Vicara procured from a locked cabinet in the archive. 3 dried herbs that Merritt did not recognize but that smelled like hot copper and made the broth steam even after it cooled. She wore heavy gloves and a leather apron. She placed the pot 20 paces from the jaw, as close as the heat allowed without blistering skin, and retreated to the doorway and waited. On the first night of the fortified broth, it took Ashenvale 40 minutes to reach the pot. The tongue moved with agonizing slowness, and the pot scraped across the stone, and the broth vanished in 3 long pulls, and the head sank back to the floor. But the heat near the body was stronger. Merritt felt it through the gloves. The dragon was warmer than the day before, which meant its metabolism was waking, which meant the broth was working. On the second night, Novice Prin was waiting at the top of the stair when she came back up. The young woman's face was white, and her hands were knotted in her prayer sash. I saw you go down, Prin said. The first law isn't your concern. The shaman knows. Merritt weighed the answer. He gave me the recipe. Prin stared at her. Then she stepped aside. She did not report it. She did not speak of it again. But from that night on, Merritt found a second pair of gloves left on the counter by the stairway door, heavier, better insulated, the kind used for handling the temple's baking ovens. She never asked who left them. On the fourth night, it took 20 minutes. The tongue was stronger. The eyes were clearer, the cataracts thinning at the edges, amber showing through like sun through morning fog. And something new, as Merritt retreated to the doorway, the head turned. Not much, an inch, maybe two, but the eyes tracked her across the room with a focus that had not been there before. Awareness, recognition. The dragon knew who she was. On the sixth night, one of the damaged scales near Ashenvale's shoulder cracked and fell away, and the scale beneath it was bright. Not the dull verdigris of decay, but a deep burnished bronze that caught the light from the fungi and held it. Merritt heard the scale hit the floor from the doorway, a sound like a ceramic tile dropping, and she saw the new surface underneath, and she understood that the dragon was not just feeding. It was molting, shedding the dead weight of 4 centuries. On the seventh night, Ashenvale raised its head, 2 feet off the stone, no more, and only for a moment. But the neck muscles bunched and held, and the jaw opened, and a sound came out that was not the rattling breath Merritt had grown used to. It was lower, rounder, and it filled the undercroft like a pipe organ finding its lowest note. On the ninth night, the heat near Ashenvale's body had grown intense enough to scorch the leather on Merritt's apron from 15 paces. She had to set the pot at 25 paces instead and back away further. The dragon dragged itself forward to reach it, not the tongue this time, but the whole body, inching across the stone with a grinding sound that vibrated through the floor above. When Merritt came back upstairs, there were hairline cracks in 2 of the kitchen flagstones. Vicara saw them the next morning. He knelt, ran his thumb along the crack, and said nothing for a long time. "The energy output is increasing," he said finally. "The ward stones are absorbing most of it, but there's bleed. If this continues at the current rate, the outer stones will start to fracture within the month. Can you reinforce them?" "I can try." The old records describe a renewal ritual, but it requires a shaman's full concentration for 3 days. I'd have to close the temple to visitors. "Then close it." He looked at her. "You understand that if the ward stones fracture completely, the sovereign's energy signature will broadcast across the plateau. Every dragon remnant in the upper ranges will feel it. That signal will travel." "I understand." "And you're still going down tonight." She was already heating the marrow. Merritt felt it in her breastbone. She understood what Vicara had meant about the sovereign bond. There was a pull, not a compulsion, exactly more like the gravitational awareness of standing near a cliff edge. Not a push, but a knowledge that the edge was there. Her feet wanted to move forward. Her hands wanted to reach out. Some part of her that she had not consulted wanted to sit down beside that massive jaw and stay there. She did not move. She had spent 30 years in kitchens. She knew the difference between what you wanted to do and what needed doing. What needed doing right now was retreating up the stair, washing the pot, and getting ready for tomorrow. She stayed by the door, set down the pot, retreated up the stair. But on the landing she paused. She pressed her hand to the warm groove in the wall, the handhold worn by shamans, and she stood there for a full minute, breathing. Below her, through the stone, she felt the dragon's breath slow into something like sleep, and she felt something she had not expected to feel. Relief, not hers, the dragon's. Relief that someone had come and fed it, and stayed long enough to hear it make a sound that was not pain. She climbed the rest of the stairs and found Vicara waiting at the top, as he waited every night now. He studied her face the way a physician studies a patient. The cataracts, thinning. The head, lifted 2 feet, 6 seconds. He closed his eyes. It's recovering faster than the old records describe. Maybe because the old shamans weren't using goat marrow. Their records say elk, but elk haven't been on the plateau in a century. It's not the marrow, it's you. She frowned. I'm a cook. The broth is the broth. The seal opened for you. The 7 locks responded to your palm. The old shamans needed blood and ritual and a solstice alignment. You touched it and it let you through. Maybe the mechanism was old. The mechanism was maintained every 6 months. By me. He leaned against the wall. There is an older set of records, forbidden ones not by the first law but by the shamans who came before me, sealed in the archive behind a wax imprint I was told never to break. I broke it last night. Merritt waited. The sovereign bond doesn't happen to everyone. It can't. The old records describe it as a resonance, the sovereign's energy finding a match in a living being. In 400 years, thousands of people have walked above this undercroft. Novices, shamans, pilgrims, groundskeepers. None of them triggered the seal. None of them heard the breathing through the floor. I have good hearing. You have a resonance. The first one in 4 centuries. The sovereign is not recovering because of the broth, Merritt. It's recovering because the bond is forming. You are feeding it, and in return it is reaching for you. And if the bond completes, 2 things happen. First, Ashenvale wakes fully. Second, the Ash Court will know. They've been waiting 400 years. They will come. Merritt was quiet for a long time. How long? She asked. At this rate, weeks, maybe less. She picked up the empty iron pot. Then I'd better make tomorrow's batch stronger. He stared at her. You understand what I'm telling you? You're telling me that a creature has been left alone in the dark for 400 years because a treaty said contain, and every shaman since then heard forget. You're telling me that the reason I can hear it and no one else can is because something in me matches something in it. And that scares you because the last time that match happened, cities burned. And you're telling me that if I keep going, a court of very old, very powerful dragons is going to show up at this temple and want answers. Yes. Shaman Vikara, I have fed people through mine collapses, hospital outbreaks, and a refugee camp where the administration forgot to send rations for 11 days. If you think a few ancient dragons showing up angry is going to stop me from feeding a starving creature, you are overestimating dragons and underestimating cooks. He didn't argue. There was nothing to argue with. She was not being brave. She was not being defiant. She was being a cook. The days accelerated. On night 10, Merritt found something in the undercroft that she had not noticed before. Along the far wall, behind the curve of Ashenvale's tail, there was a shelf carved into the stone. On it, a clay water jug, cracked and dry. A folded blanket, so old the fibers disintegrated when she touched them. A wooden spoon, blackened by heat. And a book, small, hand-bound, its leather cover warped and brittle but still holding together. She opened it carefully. The handwriting was angular and precise, and the language was old but readable. It was a log, dated entries, spanning what appeared to be several years. The name at the front was Tessara. The first entry read, "The sovereign will not eat from the trough. I brought broth in a bowl. It drank. I think it has been a long time since anyone brought it something made by hand." Merritt sat on the stone floor with the book in her lap and Ashenvale's breathing filling the space around her, and she read. Not all of it, the pages were fragile and some were illegible, but enough. Tessara had been a field surgeon. She had come to the temple after the war, not as a pilgrim but as a volunteer medic. She had heard the breathing through the floor on her second night, the same way Merritt had. She had gone down, she had brought broth, she had stayed. The entries tracked a progression that Merritt recognized. The slow recovery, the clearing eyes, the first sounds that carried meaning, the pull in the breastbone, the bond. Tessara had described it with clinical precision, a surgeon's language applied to something that had no medical category. The resonance is bilateral, she had written. It flows both ways. I give it company, it gives me certainty. I don't know a better word. A certainty that what I'm doing matters at a scale I can't see but can feel. The final entries were shorter, more urgent. Tessara had tried to speak on Ashenvale's behalf during the treaty talks. She had presented evidence of the evacuation, the controlled burn, the 0 casualties. The council had listened. The council had not believed. The final entry was 3 words: they chose fear. Merritt closed the book. She set it back on the shelf, beside the blackened spoon and the empty jug and the blanket that was falling to dust. She looked at the dragon, whose amber eyes were open and watching her with an expression she could not name but could feel through the growing bond like a hand on her shoulder. "I found her things," she said. The dragon's exhale was long and slow, and the sound it carried was the sound of a creature that had outlived the one person who had understood it and had been waiting 400 years for another. She picked up the empty pot. "I'll be back tomorrow." On night 11, Vikara began the Wardstone renewal. He closed the temple gates, sent the novices to their cells, and spent 3 days in the courtyard with chalk and blood and a chant that had not been spoken aloud in 2 generations. Merritt brought him meals between his circuits of the 7 pillars. He ate without tasting. On the second night, halfway through a bowl of stew, he said, without looking up, "I found the other records, the ones about Tessara." Merritt sat across from him. She did not speak. She was right about all of it: the firebreak, the evacuation, the 0 casualties. The evidence was in the archive the entire time. My predecessor had it. His predecessor had it. They all had it. He set the bowl down. And they all kept the first law anyway. Because it was easier to guard a secret than to admit the secret was a lie. "And you?" He looked at his hands. "I told myself I was protecting people, that the sovereign was too dangerous to release, regardless of the history, that the treaty existed for a reason." He paused. "But I renewed the seal every solstice, Merritt. I pressed my hand to that door and felt it pulse, and I knew there was something alive on the other side, and I walked away every time. For 31 years. She reached across the table and set the bowl back in front of him. "Eat," she said. "The guilt will keep, the stew won't." He ate. She went down to the undercroft. The feeding continued. On night 12, Ashenvale stood. Not fully, the legs shook and the wings stayed pressed tight, and the tail curled like a counterbalance. But the body rose from the floor for the first time in what Vikara's record suggested was over 200 years. The undercroft shook. Dust fell from the vaulted ceiling. Upstairs, 3 novices woke and reported tremors. The wardstones pulsed with a light Vikara had never seen: amber, not the usual blue-white, as if the dragon's energy was coloring the very wards meant to contain it. On night 14, Merritt noticed something that stopped her at the doorway. The fallen scales, the dead ones, the verdigris-crusted husks that had littered the floor around Ashenvale's body for centuries, were gone, not swept away, absorbed. The stone floor where they had lain was scorched in the shape of each scale, and the dragon's body was visibly larger, the ridges along the spine more pronounced. The claws, those great curved instruments that had been curled inward in weakness, now extended flat against the stone, each one gleaming with the deep bronze that was spreading across the entire hide. She reported this to Vikara. He went pale. "The renewal cycle," he said. "The old records describe it. A sovereign that feeds after prolonged starvation doesn't just recover, it rebuilds. Every piece of itself that decayed becomes raw material. The dead scales, the thinned membranes, the weakened bone, it consumes its own decay and converts it. The creature you're feeding isn't healing, Merritt. It's reconstructing itself from the inside out." "Is that dangerous?" "To us, no. To the Wardstones, extremely." On night 15, the cataracts cleared completely. Merritt saw the eyes for the first time without the film: deep amber shot through with veins of molten gold, pupils like vertical canyons, and behind them an intelligence so vast and so patient that she had to look away. Not from fear, from the sheer weight of being seen by something that old. She felt, for one vertiginous moment, the sensation of her own smallness, not as insignificance, but as a factual observation, the way a pebble might feel the nearness of a mountain. She was small. The thing looking at her was not, and it was looking at her as though she were the most important thing in the undercroft. She set down the pot. "Eat," she said, the way she said it to everyone, "before it gets cold." The amber eyes blinked, slow as a sunset, and the great head lowered to the broth. On night 18, Ashenvale spoke. Not in words. Dragons did not use words the way humans did. The sound came from somewhere deep in the chest, a harmonic that Marit felt more than heard, and it carried meaning the way music carries emotion, not in vocabulary but in shape. She understood it the way she understood a child crying from hunger versus crying from pain. Different need, different pitch. This one meant stay. She sat against the doorframe with the empty pot beside her, and she stayed for 2 hours while the great bronze head rested on the floor and the eyes watched her, and the breathing steadied into something that no longer rattled. It asked me to stay, she told Vekara afterward. She was sitting at the kitchen table, still in her leather apron, a cup of cold tea between her hands. Her fingertips were pink from the heat, even through the gloves. Not in words, in I don't know, a sound that meant something. His face did something complicated. Fear and hope, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from watching something inevitable approach, and not knowing whether to run or open the door. The bond, he said. Maybe. Or maybe it's been alone for 400 years and someone sat with it. Maybe the sound meant thank you. Maybe it meant don't go yet. Those aren't mystical. Those are just lonely. Those might be the same thing. They're not. One is a mystical chain, the other is company. I know the difference. I've been lonely, Vekara. After the mines collapsed and I lost after the valley. I know what it feels like to make a sound because you need someone to hear it. That's not a bond. That's just being alive. He wasn't sure she did. He wasn't sure he did either. The Forbidden Records described the sovereign bond as the deepest connection possible between a dragon and another being, not ownership, not servitude, but a resonance so complete that the bonded pair could feel each other's pain, share each other's strength, and in the old stories, die within hours of each other. The Forbidden Records had a name for a bond bearer, the anchor. The being whose presence kept the sovereign tethered to something beyond itself, beyond the vast, cold patience of a creature that measured time in centuries. Without an anchor, a sovereign turned inward, became stone, became the kind of stillness that even other dragons feared. The records also described what happened when an anchor died, in detail. In the handwriting of a shaman who had witnessed it from 12 miles away, and still bore the burned scars. The first law had been written to prevent exactly this, not because the bond was cruel, but because the last time a sovereign had bonded, the bonded human had died of old age, and the sovereign's grief had burned an entire valley to glass. The mountains on either side of that valley were still fused smooth. Nothing grew there. The local name for the place translated roughly as the sovereign's tears, though the shaman's records noted, with clinical precision, that the actual temperature had been closer to what you'd find at the surface of a small star. The treaty was not about containment. It was about preventing Ashenvale from ever loving something fragile enough to die. Vekara told her this on the night of day 20, standing at the top of the stair with his hands shaking. He had spent the day reading the Forbidden Records again, all of them, from the beginning, in the order they had been written, and the pattern they revealed was not what his training had taught him. The early shamans had not feared Ashenvale. They had grieved for it. The first 3 generations of record keepers described the sovereign with something close to tenderness, a creature of immense power that had done an immense kindness, and been punished for it by beings who could not comprehend the scale of either. The fear had come later. Later shamans, further from the event, had read the accounts of the valley fire without reading the accounts of the evacuation that preceded it. They had seen the destruction and missed the mercy, and each successive shaman, inheriting the fear of his predecessor rather than the records of the original witnesses, had tightened the law a little further, fed the dragon a little less, visited a little less often, until one day a shaman decided that visiting was unnecessary and the Undercroft fell silent and Ashenvale began to starve. Marit listened. She listened the way she had listened to doctors explaining what had happened in the mine collapse, and to administrators explaining why the refugee rations were late, and to her own mother explaining why her father was not coming home. She listened with her hands folded and her jaw set, and the particular stillness of a woman who has been told difficult things before, and has learned that the listening is the part you cannot skip. Then she picked up the iron pot. "You're saying the last sovereign loved someone so much that losing them destroyed a valley?" "Yes." "And the solution was to lock the sovereign in a hole and let it starve alone forever?" "The solution was to prevent the bond from forming again." "The solution was cruelty dressed up as caution. Those aren't the same thing." She started down the stair. "And I am not going to stop feeding a starving creature because someone 400 years ago decided that love was too dangerous to allow." "Marit, Vikara, I have buried 2 children." Her voice did not break. It never broke. It was the voice of a woman who had done her grieving in private and come out the other side with the kind of clarity that only grief provides. "I know what it costs to love something you can lose. You don't fix that cost by taking away the ability to love. You fix it by making sure the love is worth the cost. By showing up every day with the broth and the bread and the willingness to sit in the dark with something that is hurting." She paused on the 3rd step. "Has anyone ever asked Ashenvale what it wants?" He had no answer. None of the shamans in 400 years of guardianship had ever gone down the stair and asked the prisoner what it needed. They had maintained the seal. They had renewed the wards. They had kept the first law, and they had never once considered the possibility that the law itself was the cruelty. She went down. That night was different. Ashenvale was not lying on the floor. The sovereign was sitting upright the first time Marit had seen the full silhouette, and it filled the undercroft the way a cathedral fills the space around it, not by being decorated, but by being built on a scale that makes the human body feel exactly as small as it is. The head was 10 feet above the floor. The wings were half extended, the damaged membranes catching light from the fungi and showing veins of new growth, darker bronze, thicker, woven through the translucent tissue like thread through lace. The claws were flat on the stone, each one polished by the dragon's own body heat until they gleamed. Marit set the pot on the floor. The heat was intense. She could feel it through the soles of her boots, through the leather apron, on the skin of her face. She retreated to 25 paces, 30. Ashenvale looked down at her. The amber eyes were fully clear, and in them Marit saw something she had not seen before: intention. Not the passive gratitude of a starving creature receiving food. Something active, a decision being made. The dragon opened its jaw, not to eat. The sound that came out was different from the stay of Night 18. It was layered, multiple harmonics at once, the way a chord is more than a single note. Marit felt it in her chest, her hands, the bones of her skull, and for a moment her vision doubled. She saw the valley. Not the present-day valley, the sovereign's tears, the fused glass wasteland. She saw it as it had been 400 years ago, green, farmed, dotted with villages and threaded with irrigation channels. She saw smoke rising from the western ridge, not dragon fire but wildfire, advancing in a front that covered the horizon. She saw the evacuation, wagons on roads, families running, livestock being herded through stone gates. She saw a woman in a field surgeon's coat, Tessara. She knew without knowing how, standing on a hill with her arms raised, directing the last of the wagons through a pass. And she saw Ashenvale, not the starving ruin she had been feeding. Ashenvale at full strength, bronze scales burning gold in the fire's light, wings spread so wide they threw shadows across the entire valley, rising from the plateau's highest peak with a precision that spoke of calculation, not rage. The firebreak that followed was surgical, a controlled line of flame that met the wildfire and consumed its fuel and left the land behind it scorched but whole. The villages behind the line were untouched. The wagons in the pass were safe. Then she saw the treaty, A council chamber. Humans in robes and armor speaking over each other. Tessara standing before them with evidence and being ignored. The gavel falling. The vote. An Ashenvale, led in chains made of warded iron, being walked down the spiral stair for the last time, its wings already folding, its eyes already dimming, the bond with Tessara stretching like a wire pulled too thin. The vision faded. Merritt was on her knees on the Undercroft floor, her hands flat on the stone, her breath coming in gasps. The heat near Ashenvale's body should have burned her at this distance. It didn't. The bond was between them, now not complete, not yet, but close enough that the sovereign's heat recognized her as part of itself and pulled away from her skin the way a campfire pulls away from a poker. She looked up at the dragon. The dragon looked down at her. "I understand," she said. "They used you, you tried to help, and they locked you in a hole for it." The dragon's exhale was a low, slow note that she felt in the floor and in her teeth, and in the part of her chest where the bond was growing. It meant, she was sure of this, as sure as she had ever been of anything it meant. You are the first person in 400 years to see what actually happened. She stood up. Her legs were shaking, but her hands were steady. "Then we fix it. I don't know how, but we fix it." On night 21, she told Vekara about the vision. He sat very still for a long time. "The sovereign showed you its memory," he said. "Is that part of the bond?" "It's the last stage before completion. The sovereign shares itself, not just its warmth, not just its presence, but its history, its truth. It's asking you to know it completely before you choose." "Before I choose what?" "Whether to stay." She looked at him. "I've been staying every night for 3 weeks. Staying in the Undercroft, not staying in the bond. The bond is permanent, Merritt. It doesn't end. Not when you leave the room, not when you sleep, not when you die. You carry the sovereign with you, and the sovereign carries you for the rest of your life." He paused. "Which, according to the old records, will be longer than you expect. Bond bearers don't age at the normal rate. Tessara lived 97 years and she looked 50 when she died." Merritt considered this. She considered it the way she considered everything practically, without melodrama, weighing the information against the reality of her situation. 97 years of carrying broth down a spiral staircase, she said. "Roughly. Better get a stronger pot then." Night 23 was when the wardstones failed. Not all of them. 3 of the 7 outer stones cracked during a second storm smaller than the first, but Ashenvale was stronger now, and the resonance between the dragon and the waking bond was feeding energy back into the stone in pulses that the old wards were never designed to contain. Vekara felt them go like teeth cracking in his jaw. He ran to the courtyard, barefoot, his prayer beads catching on the door frame and snapping, and found 3 pillars split clean down their centers, the carved glyphs dark for the first time in centuries. Stone dust hung in the air like mist. The 4th pillar was cracked but holding. The 5th, 6th, and 7th were intact, 4 functioning wardstones out of 7. Vekara knelt beside the nearest broken pillar and pressed his hand to the fracture, and the stone was warm not from the storm, but from within, as if something were flowing through the old channels in the wrong direction. Energy going out instead of containing in. The call went out. He didn't know exactly how. 4 wardstones should have been enough to contain the signal. The mathematics of the old wards were clear on this point. 3 was the minimum for containment, and 4 provided redundancy. But the energy flowing through the broken channels wasn't the same energy the wards had been built to hold. It was warmer, richer, tinged with something that felt, to Vekara's trained senses, like a heartbeat overlaid with a second heartbeat, the 2 rhythms not quite in sync but pulling toward alignment. The bond. The wards had been built to contain a sovereign's raw power. They had no protocol for a sovereign's love. By dawn the next day, the temperature on the upper plateau had dropped 5 degrees. By mid-morning, the goats in the temple's pen were pressing against the far wall, oriented toward the mountain slopes, their eyes wide and their bleeding constant. By noon, the first shadow crossed the sun. It was not a cloud. Merritt was in the kitchen when Novice Prin burst through the door, white-faced and stammering. The young woman had been crying not from fear exactly, but from the kind of overwhelmed awe that comes from seeing something the rational mind cannot process. "They're here, on the ridge. We can see them from the bell tower, there." "Breathe," Merritt said. She set down the pot she was holding. "Show me." She walked out into the courtyard. She did not need the bell tower. She looked up at the ridge line that marked the eastern edge of the plateau, where the temple's grounds gave way to the mountain slopes above, and the ridge was different. Dragons. 7 of them, perched along the ridge like a row of gargoyles carved from obsidian and copper and deep, deep red. The smallest was the size of the temple's dining hall, the largest the one at the center, whose scales were so dark they seemed to swallow light, was large enough that its shadow covered the courtyard in full. Its wings were folded, but even folded, the span was visible, each wing joint as thick as the temple's main pillar, the membrane between the bones dark and veined with something that pulsed faintly, like a second set of arteries visible through translucent skin. The ash cord. They had been waiting 400 years. The Wardstone's failure had told them everything they needed to know. The sovereign lived, the seal was broken, and someone had formed a bond. They had not come in a rush. They had come in a procession, deliberate, ancient, each dragon taking its position on the ridge in an order that spoke of rank and ceremony, and a patience that made 4 centuries feel like an afternoon. Vikara was already in the courtyard, his ceremonial vestments pulled on over his nightclothes, the formal treaty scroll clutched in both hands. He was speaking the words his predecessor had taught him, the invocation of the Accord of Containment, the declaration of the temple's jurisdiction, the assertion that the Wardstones constituted an inviolable boundary. His voice was steady, his hands were not. The dark dragon at the center lowered its head. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the weight of something that had been patient for longer than the temple had existed. Its eyes were the color of cooling magma, dark red shot through with threads of molten orange, and they were not looking at Vikara. They were looking past him, past the crumbled Wardstones and the panicked novices, and the shaman reciting a treaty that the Ash Court had never signed, at Merritt, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with a ladle in one hand and a pot of morning porridge in the other, her apron stained with yesterday's turmeric and today's goat fat. Her expression the same expression she wore when the supplies were late, and the line was long, and the work was what it was. "Shaman," the dark dragon said, and its voice shook the flagstones beneath Merritt's feet. "The treaty is void. The Wardstones are broken. The sovereign has called, and we have answered." "The sovereign is still sealed," Vikara said, and his voice was steady even if his hands were not. "The Undercroft holds. The first law was written by those who feared what they could not control. We did not come for war, shaman. We came because for the first time in 400 years, we can feel our sovereign's heartbeat again, and it is not alone." The dragon's gaze returned to Merritt. "The bond-bearer," it said, "we feel you in the resonance. You have touched what no one has touched. You have fed what no one has fed. You have stayed when every law said to leave." Merritt set the porridge pot on the courtyard wall. She looked at the dragon the way she looked at everything directly, without drama, and with the faint impatience of a woman who had work to do. "If you've come for Ashenvale," she said, "it needs more than rescue. It needs about 300 pounds of bone marrow and someone to reseal the cracks in its wing membranes. I've been doing what I can with goat stock and mineral salt, but I'm one cook with one kitchen. If you want to help, help." The silence that followed was enormous. 7 dragons on the ridge, 14 novices pressed against the bell tower windows, 1 shaman in his nightclothes, and a cook in a stained apron telling the Ash Court that their 400-year vigil could have ended sooner if someone had just brought better supplies. The dark dragon, the Ash Regent, Vekara would later learn, the one who had held the court together for 4 centuries, while the sovereign was sealed, lowered its head until its jaw was level with Marit's chest. Its breath was hot enough to make her apron strings curl. "You are not afraid." "I'm too busy to be afraid. Are you going to help, or are you going to keep perching dramatically on the ridge?" The regent's eyes closed. When they opened, something had changed in them, something that Vekara recognized from the forbidden records as the acknowledgement, the moment when the court recognized a bond-bearer as legitimate. It was not a ceremony. It was not a choice. It was a dragon seeing, for the first time, the being their sovereign had chosen, and understanding why. "Show us," the regent said. Marit looked at Vekara. He was clutching the treaty scroll in both hands, the formal words still half-formed on his lips. He looked old, she thought, older than 64. He looked like a man who had spent 3 decades bracing for something, and now that it was here, he didn't know how to stop bracing. "Come on," she said to him, not to the dragons, to the shaman. "You should be there too. You kept it alive this long. The seals, the solstice renewals, 31 years, that counts." Something shifted in his face. He rolled the scroll up, set it on the courtyard wall beside the cold porridge pot, straightened his vestments. "The stair may not hold them," he said. "Then we find out." She led them down. Not all of them could fit in the stairway, only the regent and 2 of the smaller court members. A pair of deep-red dragons whose scales were scarred with patterns that Vekara said were battle honors from the old war. The regent had to fold its wings tight against its body and lower its head nearly to the floor to navigate the spiral, and the stair groaned under the weight, and dust sifted from the ceiling with every step, and Marit walked ahead with one hand on the wall and the other holding the iron pot she had filled on autopilot, because she could not walk down that stair without bringing food. The rest of the court waited on the ridge, their shadows moving over the courtyard like sundials tracking a strange, accelerated noon. The novices watched from the bell tower. Prin had her hands pressed flat to the window glass, and her lips were moving prayer or wonder or both. Ashenvale was standing when they entered. Standing fully for the first time in centuries, the great bronze body filling the undercroft from wall to wall, the head nearly touching the vaulted ceiling. The wings were still folded, the membrane still thin, but the scales had regained their color, deeper bronze than Marit had yet seen, with a sheen that caught the light from the luminescent fungi and threw it back as gold. The dead scales were gone. The new growth covered every ridge and joint, and in the warm light of the undercroft, Ashenvale looked less like a ruin and more like what it was, a sovereign, old and damaged and tired but present, awake, waiting for its court the way a monarch waits for kin it has not seen in a lifetime. The regent stopped at the threshold. The 2 court members pressed against the walls. They lowered their heads. Not a bow, exactly something older, something that looked like the physical expression of an emotion that had no human word. Grief and relief and recognition, and the weight of 400 years of waiting, all compressed into the angle of a lowered jaw. Vekara watched from the doorway. His hand found the carved handhold on the wall, the same one Marit used, the same one every shaman before him had used, and he held on, and he saw, for the first time, the dragon he had been guarding as something other than a burden. He saw it as a being, vast and ancient and scarred, but a being with kin who had crossed a plateau to kneel before it. Ashenvale's eyes found the regent, found the court, found the shapes of kin it had not seen since the seal fell. The sound it made was the lowest thing Marit had ever felt, a harmonic that went below hearing and into the bones and stayed there, and she understood it without understanding how. It meant, "I remember you." The regent answered in the same register. Marit couldn't translate it, but she could feel the shape of it, an apology 4 centuries deep, and a promise, and a question directed not at the sovereign but at her. She felt the question settle against her sternum like a warm hand. "Will you stay?" She did not answer with words. She set the iron pot on the floor, the one she had carried down every night for 23 days. She knelt beside it and she began to unpack the evening's broth, the marrow, the fat, the mineral salt, the copper-smelling herbs. She worked the way she always worked, steady, efficient, with the quiet focus of a person who understood that the most important thing in any crisis was making sure someone got fed. Ashenvale lowered its head, not to the regent, not to the court, to Merritt, until the great jaw rested on the stone beside her and one amber eye, clear and depthless, watched her measure the salt. The regent spoke. "The bond is forming. It will not stop. When it completes, she will carry part of the sovereign's strength and the sovereign will carry part of her mortality. She will feel what it feels. It will know her pain. This is not a gift that can be returned." Merritt measured the salt. "I didn't ask for a gift. I brought soup." "You brought more than soup. You brought a sovereign back from the edge of death by doing the one thing every law, every shaman, and every treaty said was forbidden. You sat with it. You treated it as something worth feeding. In 400 years, no one else did." "In 400 years," Merritt said, not looking up, "no one else heard it breathing." The regent was quiet for a long time. Then it turned to Vicara, who was standing in the doorway with the worn handhold at his back and 31 years of guardianship on his face. "Shaman, you knew what was down here. You maintained the seal. You renewed the wards. You kept the first law." Vicara's jaw tightened. "Yes." "And when this woman broke it, you gave her the feeding protocol." "Yes." "Why?" Vicara looked at the dragon. He looked at the cook. He looked at the sovereign, whose great head rested on the stone beside a woman measuring salt with the same careful attention she gave to every bowl she had ever made. "'Cause in 31 years of pressing my hand to that seal," he said, "I could feel it dying, every solstice weaker, every renewal the pulse a little thinner, and I told myself that the law was more important than the life. That containment was mercy, that I was protecting the plateau." He paused. "She walked in with a bowl of broth and did in one night what I couldn't do in 31 years. She decided the creature mattered more than the rule. I couldn't argue with that. I'm not sure anyone could." The regent lowered its head, not to Vicara, not in judgment. In recognition, the same recognition it had given Merritt, but quieter, and tinged with something that might have been compassion. Because the shaman had carried a burden too, and the fact that he had carried it wrong did not mean he had carried it lightly. Merritt poured the broth into the pot, and the steam rose, and Ashenvale breathed it in, and the regent watched the cook who had broken the oldest law on the plateau and started a bond that would change the shape of the ash court for the next 1,000 years, and the dragon said nothing more, because there was nothing more to say. The ash court did not leave. They settled on the plateau not as conquerors, not as an occupying force, but as kin returning to a hearth. The process was not instant. The first 3 days were tense. The novices would not leave their cells. Vicara stood in the courtyard from dawn to dusk, mediating between 14 terrified ascetics and 7 ancient dragons, who did not entirely understand why humans kept making that sound with their throats. On the first morning, Novice Dairn opened his window shutter, saw the shadow of a wing stretching across the flagstones, and fainted. Novice Prin caught him before his head hit the sill. That night, Vicara called a gathering in the dining hall, all 14 novices, packed shoulder to shoulder around the long table, their faces lit by oil lamps and their hands folded tight in their laps. He told them the truth, all of it, the real history, the firebreak, the treaty. The 4 centuries of shamans who had chosen fear over fact. He told them about Tessara. He told them about Merritt and the broth and the bond. He did not soften it. He did not frame it as revelation or destiny. He described it as what it was, a series of failures corrected by a cook. Novice Dairn raised his hand. "Are they going to eat us?" "They hunt elk in the upper ranges," Vicara said. "They are not interested in you." "But the old texts say." "The old texts were written by the people who locked an innocent creature in a basement. I would take their assessments of dragon behavior with considerable skepticism. Dairn did not faint again, but he did not leave his cell for 2 more days. The others emerged one at a time, moving along the courtyard walls with the careful, pressed-flat posture of people trying not to attract the attention of something very large. The dragons, for their part, were patient. They had waited 400 years. A few nervous novices were not going to disturb that patience. The regent, whose name, spoken in the harmonic register, translated roughly as the one who holds the shape of the court when the center is absent, took to resting beside the courtyard well each morning, its massive head on the flagstones, its eyes half closed. The heat from its scales warmed the surrounding stone, and by the second day the novices discovered that the flagstones near the regent were the warmest spot in the courtyard, warmer even than the kitchen hearth. They began gravitating toward it the way cold bodies seek a fire, not consciously, not by decision, but by the simple physics of warmth. The deep-red pair, the scarred ones, the ones Vikara said bore battle honors, stationed themselves on opposite sides of the temple grounds like sentries, though what they were guarding was unclear. Perhaps nothing, perhaps everything. One of them had a habit of tilting its head when it heard the Vespers bell, angling one ear toward the sound the way a dog angles toward a whistle. The novices noticed. Prin, who had a musician's instinct, rang the bell an extra time that evening, and the dragon's head tilted again, and a low note emerged from its throat, not a response exactly, but a harmony, a countertone that matched the bell's frequency and held it in the air for 3 seconds after the metal stopped vibrating. The novices looked at each other. Nobody spoke. But the next morning, Prin rang the bell at dawn, and the dragon was waiting. The novices learned to walk around the regent, then to walk near it. Then, on the 4th day, Prin sat beside the regent's jaw with a cup of tea and read aloud from a prayer text, and the regent listened, and the ice broke. Vikara adapted. He was a practical man beneath the vestments, and the sight of 7 dragons helping to rebuild the wardstones they had once been imprisoned behind, not as wards against themselves, but as structural reinforcement for a temple that had been slowly crumbling for a century, gave him a pragmatism he hadn't known he possessed. The regent, it turned out, understood masonry. 2 of the court's smaller members, the deep-red pair with the battle scars, could heat stone to malleability with their breath and reshape it with a precision that would have taken human masons a week. The temple's crumbling east wall was repaired in an afternoon. The forbidden records came out of the archive, all of them. Vikara carried the sealed chest to the kitchen table and broke the remaining wax imprints one by one, and he read them aloud to Marit while she cooked, and the history they contained was not the history the temple had taught. Ashenvale had not burned the valley out of rage. It had burned the valley because the valley was burning already, a wildfire, sparked by a war between 2 human nations that had been using dragon territory as a battlefield. Ashenvale had burned a firebreak, a controlled burn, executed with the kind of precision that only a creature capable of modulating its own flame to within 100 degrees could manage. The cities in its path had been evacuated. The records listed evacuation orders, issued by the sovereign through its bond-bearer, 3 days before the burn began. Every settlement had been warned. Every settlement had cleared. The casualties had been 0. The treaty that followed had been written by the victors of the human war, not by the dragons, and the imprisonment was a punishment for a sovereign that had tried to help and been convenient to blame. The sovereign's bond-bearer at the time, a woman named Tessara, who had been a field surgeon before the bond, had died during the treaty negotiations. Not of violence, of exhaustion and grief, trying to testify on the sovereign's behalf to a council that had already decided to bury the truth. The cook who knelt beside Ashenvale every evening had not broken a just law. She had defied a lie that had been dressed in the language of caution for 4 centuries. The bond completed on a morning in late autumn. Merritt was carrying the iron pot down the stair routine, normal, the 29th day when she felt the last barrier between her awareness and Ashenvale's dissolve. It was not dramatic. There was no flash, no transformation, no glowing mark on her skin. One moment she was herself carrying a pot. The next moment she was herself carrying a pot, and she also knew with absolute certainty that the dragon in the undercroft was awake and waiting, and that its left rear leg was stiff from the cold, and that the crack in its third wing bone had been aching since midnight. She set the pot down. She pressed her hand to the wall and breathed. The bond was not what she had expected. She had expected a voice the way the stories always described it, a dragon's thoughts speaking inside a human skull. But Ashenvale did not think in words. It thought in temperatures, in pressures, in the deep, slow calculus of a body that measured time by the cooling of stone and the drift of tectonic plates. She felt the dragon's awareness of the undercroft floor, every crack, every stress line, every place where the weight of the temple above pressed the bedrock into shapes that the sovereign knew by feel the way a baker knows dough by touch. She felt the ache in the wing bone as a specific heat, a cold spot in a body that otherwise ran hotter than boiling water, the fracture radiating chill the way a chip in an oven wall leaks warmth. And she felt the dragon's awareness of her. Not her thoughts. The bond did not work that way, or if it did, it was not working that way yet. It was more like the dragon could feel her pulse, could feel the rhythm of her breathing, could feel the specific pattern of warmth that a human body produces when it is calm and focused and carrying an iron pot down a spiral staircase with the same steady purpose it has carried every pot for 30 years. Ashenvale knew her heartbeat the way she knew the sound of broth reaching a simmer, by frequency, by feel, by the deep familiarity of something you have listened to every day until it becomes part of the architecture of your attention. She could feel the size of Ashenvale's awareness like standing at the edge of an ocean, not drowning, not overwhelmed, just aware that there was a great deal more space in her mind than there had been yesterday. And in return, she felt a thread of something flowing the other direction, a warm, steady pulse of the kind of energy that made you want to get up early and feed people, the bone-deep certainty that what you did with your hands mattered, that the small work of keeping others alive was not small at all. She felt it flowing from her into Ashenvale, and she understood, for the first time, why the sovereign had chosen her. Not because she was special, not because she was destined, because she was reliable, because she was the kind of person who heard a creature breathing through a stone floor and brought it broth. The dragon that had burned a fire break to save a valley 400 years ago and been punished for it had reached through centuries of isolation and found the one quality it valued most in a bondmate, the refusal to let anything go hungry on her watch. She picked up the pot and kept walking. Her hands were steady. They had always been steady. That was the thing about being a cook. The hands knew what to do even when the mind was still catching up. Ashenvale was waiting. The dragon's head was already lowered, the amber eyes clear and warm, and through the bond, Merritt could feel the sovereign's awareness of her as a warmth in the center of her chest, not possessive, not overwhelming, but present, the way the knowledge of a lit stove in the next room is present even when you're not looking at it. A warmth you could trust. She knelt beside the jaw the way she always did. She poured the broth into the pot and sat with the sovereign of the Ash Dominion while it fed. Through the bond, she felt the broth reach the sovereign's stomach, felt the warmth spread, felt the old creature's gratitude, which was not a word or an image but a feeling like the deep exhale after carrying something heavy for a very long time and finally setting it down. She sat with it until the pot was empty. Then she sat with it a while longer, because the bond told her not in words, never in words, that the company mattered more than the broth. Above them on the ridge the ash court felt the bond complete. 7 heads lifted, 7 pairs of eyes turned toward the temple, 7 throats produced a sound that crossed the plateau like a bell, not a war cry, not a celebration, but an acknowledgement, a recognition. the oldest dragon hierarchy on the plateau, honoring a thing they had not felt in 4 centuries, their sovereign bonded, whole, no longer alone. Vikara heard it from the courtyard. He was standing beside the rebuilt wardstones, his vestments exchanged for a workman's coat because the dragons had recruited him to help with the mortar, and he looked up at the ridge and felt, for the first time in 31 years, the weight of the first law lift from his shoulders. Not because the law had been repealed, because the lie beneath it had been exposed, and the creature he had spent 3 decades guarding was no longer a prisoner but a sovereign with a bond-bearer who would sit with it every evening and bring broth and bread, and the kind of steady, unremarkable company that no prison could substitute for and no law could forbid. He went inside and added an extra chair to the kitchen table. Merritt found it that evening when she came up from the undercroft. She looked at the chair, and she looked at Vikara, and she understood. "You're staying," she said. "Someone needs to maintain the wardstones and the archive, and if I'm honest, the cooking is better here than anywhere else on the plateau." "The cooking is the same as it's always been." "Yes," he said, "that's why it's better." She sat down. He sat across from her. Through the floor, they could both feel the slow, steady pulse of Ashenvale breathing, not the thin, rattling breath of a starving creature in the dark, but the deep, settled rhythm of something that was, for the first time in 400 years, fed and held and known. Outside, the ash court settled onto the ridge for the night, their scales catching the last of the daylight, their shadows stretching long across the courtyard. In the kitchen, the cook and the shaman sat at a table with an extra chair, and the temple was quiet, and beneath them, the oldest dragon on the plateau slept with a full belly and a bond that had cost nothing more than a bowl of broth and the willingness to hear what no one else had listened for. The courtyard well, split by the first storm's lightning, had been repaired by the smallest of the court dragons, a meticulous creature with copper-bright scales who turned out to have an engineer's temperament and a fondness for structural problems. The novices had named it Kettle because of the sound its throat made when it was concentrating. It did not seem to mind. Merritt added a second pot to the evening rotation, then a third. The ash court did not require feeding. They hunted in the upper ranges and brought their own kills, but they did, one by one, begin to appear at the kitchen door in the evenings. Not to eat, to watch the cook work, to sit in the warmth of a kitchen that smelled like garlic and bone broth, and the particular kind of patience that comes from a woman who has been feeding strangers her entire life and has never once asked for thanks. The bond held, Ashenvale grew stronger. And it was not the only thing that grew. Novice Prin asked to be assigned to the archive. Vikara had never had an assistant. The archive was his solitary burden, one room of dust and secrets that no one else cared about. But Prin showed up at the archive door on a Tuesday morning with a stack of blank ledger pages and the expression of someone who had made a decision during Vespers and was not going to unmake it during breakfast. "I want to learn the old languages," she said. "The glyphs on the stair walls, the treaty text. If we're going to correct the record, someone needs to be able to read the original sources." Vikara looked at her. He saw for the first time the shape of what came after him. Not another solitary shaman carrying a secret, but a line of scholars carrying a truth. It was a different kind of weight, lighter, shared. "The glyphs are pre-treaty Asharian," he said. "The grammar is extinct. I have a partial lexicon, but it's—" "Show me." He showed her. She learned faster than he had, he admitted later to Merritt, with the grudging respect of a man who had spent 40 years being the only person who cared about a subject, and was now discovering that someone else cared more. Within a month, Prin could read the stair glyphs. Within 2, she had found an error in Vikara's lexicon, a misattributed verb form that changed the meaning of a key passage from "the sovereign must be contained" to "the sovereign chose to be contained." The distinction was enormous. Ashenvale had not been dragged into the undercroft. It had walked in voluntarily, a sacrifice, offered by the sovereign to end the conflict, to give the humans what they demanded so that the rest of the court could go free. Merritt heard this from Prin over dinner. She set down her spoon. Through the bond, she felt Ashenvale's awareness shift, not surprise, because the dragon already knew the truth, but something closer to gratitude. The fact that someone had finally read the glyphs correctly after all this time, after all those shamans walking past them every day, that mattered. Small corrections, accumulated, became revolutions. Prin also made a discovery that none of them had anticipated. In the deepest layer of the archive, beneath correspondence that predated the temple itself, she found a map. Not a map of the plateau, a map of nesting sites. Dozens of them, marked across the mountain range in the old Asherian notation, each site annotated with a glyph that Prin translated as sleeping. The map was dated 50 years after the treaty. The Ash Court had not simply withdrawn to the upper ranges. They had dispersed across the entire mountain chain, each dragon choosing a site, each one entering a kind of dormancy, not sleep, but a state of reduced existence, a way of surviving centuries without a sovereign's resonance to sustain them. The 7 who had appeared on the ridge were not the full court. They were the ones who had woken first. There were more, dozens more scattered across the mountains, still dormant, still waiting. The regent confirmed this when Prin presented the map. The great dark dragon lowered its head to the courtyard table, which creaked but held, and studied the markings with an expression that Merritt, through the bond, felt as an ache. The regent knew every site, knew every name, had visited each one during the long centuries, checking on kin who lay still as stone in caves and crevasses and hollowed-out volcanic vents, their scales fading, their fires banked, their lives preserved in a state of suspension that was not death but was not life either. They will wake, the regent said. Now that the sovereign's resonance is restored, it may take months, it may take years, but they will feel it as we felt it, and they will come. Vikara absorbed this. How many? 31. 31 dragons waking across the mountain range. 31 ancient beings, drawn toward a temple kitchen where a cook in a stained apron was already calculating how much bone marrow she would need. I'm going to need a bigger kitchen, Merritt said. Nobody laughed, but Kettle, the copper-scaled engineer, tilted its head and made the sound that had earned its name, and Prin covered her mouth, and Vikara closed his eyes and breathed out through his nose in the way that meant he was either praying or trying very hard not to smile. By the first frost, the sovereign could extend its wings in the undercroft. The membranes were still translucent in places, but the bone structure was sound, and the first time the wings spread, not flight, just an extension, a stretch that had been waiting 4 centuries, the undercroft filled with a sound like a sail catching wind in a cathedral. Merritt was there. Through the bond, she felt the stretch in her own shoulders, a phantom expansion, as if her body remembered a wingspan it had never had. By midwinter, the sovereign could climb the stair. Slowly, with the walls groaning and stone dust drifting, and the stair widening in real time under the regent's breath, the deep-scaled dragon had spent a week carefully heating and reshaping the spiral to accommodate a body that had not been designed for human architecture. Merritt went first. She always went first. She climbed the stair backward, facing Ashenvale, one hand on the wall and the other holding the iron pot, because even on the day the sovereign of the Ash Dominion returned to the surface for the first time in 4 centuries, she was not going to leave the evening broth undelivered. The head came through the stairway arch with a sound like a ship's hull scraping a dock stone against scale, a deep grinding note that shook mortar dust from the kitchen ceiling and rattled every pot hanging from the rack above the stove. The novices in the courtyard pressed back against the walls. Prin dropped her prayer text. Dairn, who had been sweeping the courtyard with the careful normalcy of a man determined to prove he was no longer afraid of dragons, stopped sweeping and stood very still with his broom held in front of him like a lance. The neck followed, then the shoulders, the forelegs bracing against the widened archway, claws digging furrows in the stone floor as Ashenvale pulled itself upward with a grinding, deliberate strength. The heat rolled ahead of it like a wave, the courtyard temperature spiked, the frost on the flagstones flashing to steam, the air shimmering the way it shimmers above a forge. And then the head rose above the kitchen wall, above the courtyard, into open air. Pale winter sunlight hit the bronze scales and the entire temple blazed. The light bounced from scale to scale and turned the courtyard into a hall of golden mirrors, every surface catching fire. Merritt had to shade her eyes. Through the bond, she felt what Ashenvale felt: the sun. Actual sun on actual scales for the first time in 400 years. The sensation hit her like a wave of vertigo, and she had to sit down on the courtyard steps, the iron pot clanging beside her, because the dragon's joy was so vast and so sudden that her human nervous system could not process the scale of it without a moment to adjust. It was not ecstasy. It was not triumph. It was the feeling of a creature that had forgotten what warmth from above felt like. Not the geothermal heat of the undercroft, not the metabolic heat of its own body slowly eating itself to stay alive, but sunlight. The kind of warmth that comes from outside, that arrives without being earned or metabolized or fought for. The kind that just lands on you because you are standing in the right place at the right time, and the sky is giving it away for free. Ashenvale closed its eyes, lifted its head another foot, and stood there in the courtyard of the temple that had been its prison, and let the winter sun do what 4 centuries of darkness had tried to make it forget was possible. On the ridge, the ash court rose to their feet, all 7 in unison, with a sound like boulders shifting in a landslide. Their wings opened not to fly, but in salute, a spread of membrane and bone that darkened the plateau for a quarter mile in every direction. The shadow passed over the courtyard and then lifted, and in the gap between shadow and sunlight, the court's harmonics rang out 7 voices in 7 registers, a chord that had not been sung since the day the sovereign was led down the stair in warded chains. The novices covered their ears. Vikara did not. He stood in the kitchen doorway and listened to a sound that his predecessors had spent 400 years making sure no one ever heard again, and he thought, for the first time in his life, that the shamans before him had been not just wrong but impoverished. They had missed this. They had lived their entire lives above this and never let themselves hear it. The novices who had spent their lives above a sealed undercroft looked up at the creature their temple had been built to contain and saw, not the destroyer the first law described, but an ancient, patient being with healing scales and clear amber eyes, and a bond-bearer who walked beside it with an iron pot in one hand and told it to watch its step on the flagstones. Merritt stood in the courtyard with the sovereign of the Ash Dominion, and the ash court on the ridge lowered their heads, and the novices watched from the bell tower, and Vikara watched from the kitchen door, and nobody knelt. Nobody had to. The recognition was not in the posture. It was in the silence, a plateau full of beings, dragon and human and shaman and novice, all looking at the same thing and understanding it without a word spoken. The cook had fed the dragon had reached for the cook, and the shaman who had guarded the seal for 31 years had not turned away when the law he'd sworn to keep turned out to be a lie. 3 unremarkable acts. No one would call them heroic, but the temple was no longer a prison, and the dragon was no longer dying, and the plateau was no longer afraid, and none of that would have happened if a woman in a stained apron had not heard breathing through a stone floor and decided it mattered. Vikara began writing a new record, not a forbidden one. An open one in the temple's main archive, in plain language that any novice could read. He used the same desk where his predecessors had written the laws that sealed the undercroft. He used the same ink, the same quill. He understood the weight of that, the same tools, a different truth. He titled it The Corrections. It began, "We were wrong." He wrote the true history of the Valley Fire, the real terms of the treaty, the name of the bond-bearer Tessara, who had died trying to tell the truth to a council that refused to hear it. The names of the shamans who had chosen fear over mercy, including the ones he respected, including the ones who had taught his predecessors and his predecessors' predecessors, because being wrong is not the same as being evil, and they deserved the honesty of being named. And he wrote the name of the cook who had chosen a bowl of soup over 4 centuries of law, and the name of the sovereign who had waited in the dark for someone to hear it breathing. And at the bottom, in the space where the old records would have listed the first law and its prohibitions, he wrote something different. Something that was not a law at all, but a recognition of what Merritt had taught him by carrying broth down a spiral staircase every night for a month, while a shaman who should have known better stood at the top and told her not to. He wrote, "The sacred is not what we seal away. The sacred is what we choose to feed." Word reached the lowland councils by the first thaw. Travelers crossing the plateau had seen the dragons on the ridge. Merchants had heard the harmonics from the valley roads. A surveyor from the Vosk Reconstruction Authority, the same district where the mine collapse had sent Merritt fleeing to the temple, climbed to the plateau to investigate reports of thermal anomalies near the old temple, and came back with a description that made the district magistrate send a formal delegation. They arrived on a cold morning in early spring, 6 officials in formal coats, carrying copies of the original treaty and a list of demands. They set up a table in the courtyard, spread their documents, and asked to speak with the authority in charge. Vecara met them. The regent watched from beside the well with the unhurried attention of a creature that had seen 1,000 such delegations in its long life and found them uniformly tedious. The chief delegate was a woman named Councillor Owen, sharp-featured and precise, with the particular kind of authority that comes from being right about zoning regulations for 20 consecutive years. She read the treaty clauses aloud. She cited containment obligations. She referenced 4 separate subarticles about the consequences of a wardstone breach and the jurisdictional responsibilities of the temple custodian. Vecara listened. He waited until she finished. Then he opened the archive chest, which he had carried to the courtyard table because he had been expecting this visit, and he laid out the original records. Not the forbidden ones, the originals, the ones the first shamans had written, the ones that documented the evacuation orders and the 0 casualties, and the controlled burn, and the treaty council that had heard the truth and voted to bury it. Councillor Owen read them. Her face went through several stages. Skepticism first, then confusion, then the tight-lipped expression of a person who has spent her career enforcing rules and is being told, with documentary evidence, that the foundational rule was a lie. "These could be fabricated," she said. "They could," Vecara agreed, "but they match the geological surveys. The valley floor is fused glass in a pattern consistent with a controlled burn, not a wildfire. Your own surveyors published that data 80 years ago." No one asked why. Owen looked at the records. She looked at the regent. She looked at Merritt, who was standing in the kitchen doorway with flour on her hands because the delegation had arrived during bread making, and she had not stopped for them. "And the bond bearer," Owen said, "what authority does she claim?" "None," Merritt said from the doorway. "I'm the cook." The delegation left that afternoon. They did not leave satisfied, but they left without issuing a formal challenge, which Vecara said was the lowland equivalent of a concession. The treaty was not repealed that would take years, hearings, councils, the kind of slow institutional grinding that makes history feel less like a story and more like a drainage project. But the first crack had appeared. The truth was in the open. The records were no longer forbidden. Merritt did not attend the negotiations. She was making bread. Through the bond, she felt Ashenvale's amusement, a sensation like warmth spreading behind her ribs, like laughter felt from the inside. The sovereign had dealt with councils before. It knew how they worked. It knew the glacial pace of institutional change, and it knew something the councilors did not, that the truth, once exposed, does not unexpose. It sits. It waits. It lets people adjust. And eventually, the structures built on the lie either adapt or collapse, because the truth has a patience that outlasts everything except stone. And dragons. The truth has a patience that outlasts everything except stone and dragons.